Thanks for having me. My name is Francesco Bianchi. I'm from Johns Hopkins University. This is joint work with Leonardo Melosi. And the key question of this paper is whether inflation is going to remain elevated. As you know, after many years of low and stable inflation, now policymakers are fighting high inflation. So in order to answer the question of whether inflation will go down quickly, we estimate a model with changes in the policy mix between a monetary-led and a fiscally led policy mix, also allowing for the possibility of changes in beliefs about the future policy mix. So our point of departure is that in the data, fiscal inflation generally explains persistent movements in inflation. So the high inflation of the 60s and 70s was the result of large fiscal spending that was accommodated by the central bank. Inflation came down when this policy mix switched, so when we moved to what we call a monetary-led policy mix. And fiscal inflation has remained relatively contained. It went up a little bit during the Great Recession, but it jumped up again in the aftermath of the pandemic recession, mostly because of the robust fiscal interventions that we implemented to rebound the economy. So in this context, the cost-push shocks, think about oil shocks, only explain transitory movements in inflation. So now the question is, if inflation is high because of fiscal shocks, what do we need to do in order to bring inflation down? So something that we show in the paper is that even if the Fed had increased rates earlier, inflation would have been down only by a small amount, while output would have contracted by a large amount. So now this is not due to cost-push shocks, because even when you remove cost-push shocks, inflation is of course lower, but the output outlook is essentially the same. This is due to the fact that when inflation has a fiscal nature, it's not enough to increase rates. So you need a change both on the monetary and fiscal side. In particular, you need changes on both sides to avoid what we call fiscal stagflation. So let me illustrate this with a simple example. So suppose that we make the central bank more and more hawkish. So you can see here we move from blue to red to yellow. It means that the central bank is increasing rates more aggressively. This generates a gain in terms of inflation in the short run, but it leads to higher inflation in the long run. Why is that? Because by generating a larger recession, the central bank forces the economy to accumulate more debt. The higher debt generates additional inflationary pressure that comes back to bite you. So instead, in this alternative scenario, what we do is to make fiscal policy more credible. In particular, we reduce beliefs that in the future we will move to a fiscally led policy mix. And as you can see, moving from blue to red to yellow, inflation goes down, not because the central bank is more hawkish, but because fiscal policy is more credible. There is the belief that fiscal policy will be able to sustain the large amount of spending, and this removes fiscal stagflation. So what we learned from this paper is that in order to have low and stable inflation, you need to have a fiscal framework that is consistent with that goal. The quick rebounded economy was in part the result of the robust fiscal interventions, but this also caused inflation. And so what we need now is changes both on the monetary and fiscal side. And taking as example the 1980s, we see that the Fed has changed policy, but the problem is that the debt-to-GDP ratio is substantially higher today than it was in the 1980s when it was at an historical minimum. Thank you.